When the media says the COVID vaccine saved lives, what do they mean by that? And how do you respond if maybe you don't buy that? Well, normally when I look at these studies, I see that they're based on math models that estimate high death rates. And because we never saw those, well, then they attribute that to the COVID vaccine. But that isn't exactly proof to me. So I went to my favorite data scientist, Regina Wateel, on this. She's the author of the now best-selling book, Fisman's Fraud. In her book, she showed how the study that the Canadian government had used to punish unvaccinated people was based on totally bogus math models. It's a fantastic read. I want to suggest that you read it. She called this hate science. So she joins us today to discuss these math models about whether or not the vaccine actually saved lives. So Regina, thank you for joining me again.
Well, thanks for having me back, Natali.
It's always a pleasure. Yes. Okay. So can you just give, if our viewers, let's say, are at a holiday party and someone says to them, well, the vaccine saved lives. Can you tell us in a quick, cocktail napkin response, how would you respond to that? And then what maybe is the data that we can use to back up how we might feel about this?
Okay, well, Natali, the scientific reality is that one cannot say that the vaccines saved more lives than they cost. The clinical trials never showed that at all. Instead, they actually showed that the mRNA vaccines carried an increased risk of serious adverse events of special interest, including death. And that increased risk outweighed any reduction in COVID-19 hospitalizations. So that was bad news for the pharmaceutical companies. So what they did was they cut their clinical trials short. And they basically unblinded the clinical trials. They offered the placebo group the vaccines, and that basically sabotaged any future comparisons between the two groups. And then when these vaccines were put on the market, there was no attempt at all to actively track the adverse events in the general population. So it became almost impossible to assess the true risk these vaccines posed to the population. So without having established a reduction in death in the clinical trials, what some researchers did was they attempted to they attempted to claim this benefit by playing with real-world data. Mm-hmm. But the problem was that real-world data was showing some very disturbing trends. So as these vaccines rolled out, we actually saw a rise in COVID cases, a rise in COVID deaths, and a rise in excess all-cause mortality. So we saw these trends in various regions throughout the world, and that's a huge problem to anyone trying to push these vaccines. Because if you're going to say the vaccines saved lives, you have to show an actual reduction in deaths. But instead, we see an increase. So some researchers, what they did was abandon proper scientific methodology and then just resort to pure fantasy. So it goes to what you were saying, Natali, with they assume that the vaccines are highly effective and they just claim things would have been worse without them.
For instance, we communicated about a chart last week presented by Our World in Data. And what we saw was that they gave us this hypothetical spike in deaths that may have happened in and around the fall of 2021. And because we never saw that, well, they attribute that to a success of the vaccine. But they don't tell us why we might have seen this spike in deaths when deaths were fairly constant throughout the second year of the pandemic. It's very confusing why they would do this. And so where do you think they got these estimated death models that never were?
Well, it goes something like this, Natali. They say that basically if we assume that the vaccines were highly effective and we saw this many deaths, then just imagine how many more we would have seen if we didn't have the vaccines. And then they construct models to simulate that imagined scenario where they assume the vaccines are highly effective and they pretend the virus was a lot more deadly than it actually was. So that's what they did in that Lancet study. The Our World data uses the Lancet study, and that study claimed 15 to 20 million lives were saved in the first year. But again, it's completely hypothetical under the assumption that the vaccines are effective. I know that here in Canada, we did a similar study that came out in 2022. So both those studies came out in 2022. And if you remember what was happening then, we had the Omicron wave. So everybody could see that these vaccines did not work. So these studies basically served to gaslight the population and to say, no, they did work. We're just going to make it up.
Well, what they meant when they said they don't work is they're not preventing transmission, when early media reports lied to us and said that they do, even though they never tested for that. They only tested for symptoms. And so they continue to put forward these estimates as if the vaccine was responsible for what most likely the real world data shows natural immunity was responsible for. Is that your assessment?
Not quite. What they did was they just made it up completely, because we didn't actually we didn't actually see a reduction. Yeah, we didn't actually even see a reduction in deaths at all. So they just said, oh, it would have been worse, right? So right. It's completely made up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then another thing that we see a lot is that they say, well, it's reduced the risk of ventilators. And so they extrapolate that as a success. What's your assessment of the risk of being put on a ventilator?
Okay, well, I'll get to that in a second. But I wanted to just mention another study that came out last month by John Ioannidis, because that study has been getting a lot of play, at least on Twitter. What he and his colleagues did was, with their study, they do a kind of reality check, but they still ignore the huge elephant in the room. So instead of creating a model simulation, what his group did is they just do a rough calculation of the number of lives they think the vaccines saved. So what they do is they estimate the number of deaths that would have occurred without the vaccines, and they just multiply it by the vaccine effectiveness. And to get the number of people who would have died without the vaccines, well, what they do is they assume that without the vaccines, almost everyone would have caught COVID by the time Omicron came around. And then they use fatality estimates based on COVID deaths that occurred before the vaccines were rolled out. But if you recall, Natalie, COVID deaths are people who died with COVID, not because of COVID, right?
Right.
And so a lot of people think that fatality is an exaggeration, because if you recall, the CDC actually came out early in the pandemic and stated that 94% of COVID-related deaths had one or more comorbid conditions, with an average of 4 additional causes of death. So that fatality estimate is already high. And so they take that number of people that they thought would have died without vaccines, and they times it by vaccine effectiveness, but they just assume that the vaccines are effective at preventing death. It's not proven, it's not established, it's just an assumption. And when they do that, they get 2.5 million COVID deaths averted since the introduction of these vaccines. And 1 million of those being in the first year, mostly the elderly. But why I bring this up is that estimate is already over an order of magnitude less than that Lancet study, right?
Yeah,
because Johnny
that's
Ioannidis,
2.5 million versus 20 million. So people are just very comfortable with that spread. Like, oh yes, that must be it. Fine.
But it's actually worse, because he's saying 2.5 up to now, and only 1 million in the first year. And the Lancet said 20 million in the first year. But it gets worse than that, because Ioannidis and his colleagues even admit that they completely ignored any deaths due to the vaccine or any injuries due to the vaccine, right? And they also didn't try to explain the increase in access mortality, right? So when you don't consider those things, the Ioannidis 2.5 million lives saved, that's pretty meaningless, and it's actually misleading, because even if you assume 2.5 million COVID deaths were averted, that's of little consolation if the vaccines themselves cause 17 million excess deaths, which is what Canadian researcher Denny Rancourt is claiming, right? So
Yeah, that's not a good trade-off. That's negative
it's not.
benefit. Yeah.
Right. So if you look at, and this gets into what you were asking with the ventilators to some degree, because what Denny Rancourt does is he looks at the access deaths that occurred between 2020 and 2022, and he estimates about 31 million access all-cause mortality deaths, right? And he tries to figure out what possibly could have caused these extra deaths. So what he does is he looks at the pattern of the deaths and the timing of the deaths in the various countries around the world, and he draws three conclusions. He says that those trends are not consistent with the spread of a viral pathogen. So he says that the actual COVID virus doesn't really explain that increase in access all-cause mortality. But he says that those trends are consistent with the timing and introduction of various public policies. So he talks about things like the lockdowns. He talks about improper treatment, like being put on the mechanical ventilators or not being given antibiotics when you have a bacterial infection. And he also looks at how the access deaths increased as the vaccines were rolled out in certain subpopulations. So he says that all those public policy measures, they are consistent with the deaths, and so he attributes the 31 million access deaths to public policy. And 17 million of those, he says, is due to he thinks is due to the vaccine alone.
So just this week, Joe Biden extended the emergency measures for the COVID vaccine, and so that the pharmaceutical companies continue to have liability and it continued to be on the market with emergency use authorization. And so do you think that there is big pharma funding behind these studies in order to be able to do that? Is there any rational reason to do it? Who's behind these studies, do you think, and these moves?
Well, these studies claiming that lives were saved, they're not scientific at all. They're pure fantasy. They're based completely on assumptions. And as I mentioned, because things were not established in the clinical trials, they looked at real-world data. They tried to play with that. And when real-world data didn't look good, they simply made things up. So that's where things are headed. So who is funding that? I mean, you would think that it has to do with big pharma because they're the ones who are benefiting from this. But a lot of governments will go along with it because there was a lot of opportunity that this presented for them as well.
Yeah. And so
a lot of these studies, a lot of these studies, you know, like here in Canada, a lot of these bogus studies are funded by our own federal government. They continue to fund fraudulent studies.
With very little fallout. I mean, that's one of the main plots of your book is who was behind it. You went to the universities and the academic journals that published this hate science, and you were met with pushback when you were clearly showing them these are bogus mathematical models that are being used to hurt people. And so where are you in asking for accountability from that?
Well, there's been a lot of activity here, Natali, because the federal agency continued to fund Fisman, who was our front man for pandemic modeling. After I showed that his study that was used to prop up the travel restrictions and the mandates was completely bogus, they continued to fund him. And then they were asked about the funding of these studies and whether they received any negative feedback after the publication. And they actually had the nerve to say they didn't, despite the fact that I wrote a book on it and our correspondence is published. So they actually said, no negative feedback, and they continued to fund Fisman. So I've gone back to them. And again, they're still backing him. My book was mentioned again in Parliament last week. So that's promising. But they show it doesn't look like they're slowing down with this at all.
Gosh. Okay. Well, you're doing the work. You can follow Regina's amazing adventures on X at Regina Wateel. And again, I want to tell you to look out for the book. It's called Fisman's Fraud. And yeah, it reads a little bit like The Fugitive, the movie, the Harrison Ford film. And it's real. This is our lives now. So thank you for your time coming on Redacted. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much again for having me back. Thanks, Natalie.